Welcome to The Bridgehead with Jonathon Van Maren, bringing you cutting-edge news, commentary, and interviews from the front lines of the culture wars.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Bridgehead. We're so glad you could join us today, and of course, the topic of discussion today has to be Monday's election, which, contrary to what everyone predicted and everyone thought, the Liberals under Justin Trudeau won a majority government. This is something that, I wasn't even expecting, even though I had predicted that the Liberals would get a minority. I didn't think the Conservatives were going to win government again. At the same time, even I was shocked by the sheer sweep that the Liberals did, across the GTA, the 905, Atlantic Canada. It was unbelievable just how many seats that they won. So I wanted to spend the show today sort of chatting about the election and what we can expect in the next 4 years and, how the campaign went, why we lost so badly. So to do that, I gave my friend Andrew Lawton a call. Andrew Lawton, somebody I've known for quite a few years, and he has been involved in all sorts of things. He currently runs a fantastic radio show on AM 980 in London. Whenever I can pick up that show on my radio, even if it's a bit fuzzy, I always do listen to it. He's interviewed all three party leaders, or I guess former party leaders, since Prime Minister Stephen Harper has stepped down as the leader of the Conservative Party since last week's election. But he talked to Stephen Harper, Justin Trudeau, and Tom Mulcair. His show in London is fantastic on AM 980 if you ever get the chance to listen to it. So I was really happy to have him on to talk about the election and what went wrong. How did you react to Monday?
It was a bit of a mixed reaction because on one hand, I was expecting a Justin Trudeau victory. That wasn't a surprise. But the regions that he managed to win over, certainly the margin by which he won the populace over with a majority government was a bit surprising. I mean, there's a selfish benefit to this, which is that as a radio host, I have 4 years of great content now from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Yeah. But as far as the direction that Canada needs to go, I can't say that it was the result I was hoping for.
So what are the things, I've been talking to a lot of people, right, because the pro-life movement is pretty discouraged. Obviously conservatives are very discouraged, and I kind of I go back and forth in terms of whether or not conservatives should feel discouraged. Like, you talked to Stephen Harper a bunch of times. I went to a bunch of his events here, too, to report on them. Like, there's been no prime minister who won the fourth term since Wilfrid Laurier, right? I don't think that people quite realize just how unusual the thing he was going for was. So, how unlikely do you see this as?
Yeah, that's another side of it. But the one thing that I've said to people who bring up the fourth term question there is that it's important to keep in context that we're not looking at full terms here either. I mean, in some cases, there were times in history where if you had served 4 terms or you had served 3 terms, that was 12 years.
Right.
That was 16 years. Whereas when you're dealing with the first 2 of your 3 elections being minority parliament, you don't get the legacy building opportunities. Not that that's what politics is about, that some of those people you've mentioned have, your Lauriers, your Mackenzie Kings, and so on and so forth. So it was unlikely, but I don't think it was unlikely because no leader had ever done it. I think it was unlikely because you were looking at a person who was, and I respect a great deal about Stephen Harper, but he was a polarizing figure in Canadian politics, and whether rightfully or wrongfully, there was a coordinated campaign not to advance ideas of their own, not to advance policies that they wanted to put forward, not to endorse a candidate that they wanted, but to defeat Stephen Harper. So when you're up against that level of political antagonism, if you will, it's a pretty tough nut to crack electorally.
Yeah, do you think that's a bit weird? So for me, with Stephen Harper, I've met him 4 or 5 times. You've interviewed him a few times. My complaint always about him was that he was just that. He was sort of very, boring and managerial. And if you read John Ibbitson's biography, that was very intentional. I don't quite understand the sheer depth of the feeling against him. Like the people on my Facebook page, I got plenty of liberal university friends yet, for some reason, are sort of rejoicing in the second coming of Trudeau and so glad that the evil man Harper left. And the thing is, the pro-life movement hasn't exactly been thrilled with Harper over the last 8 years. He hasn't been our friend, right? He's not a pro-life person himself, and he did his best with Motion 408 to shut it down. So for me, I had sort of a very balanced view of him. He's the best of the options on the table, but he's not sort of the great savior, and he's certainly not some evil Maleficent either. Why do people have such strong figures about somebody who's so careful not to display strong feelings?
Well, I think you touched on a really important point in the question there that I wanted to address before I can answer the broader question you asked, and that is that you're saying as a pro-lifer, Stephen Harper, not pro-life himself, never gave pro-lifers any ground in caucus, in fact, quashed those in the caucus who did fit into that group. And if you were to go and poll, I say the average person, what's Stephen Harper's position on abortion, they're going to tell you, he wants, to ban a woman's right to choose.
Right, yeah.
That's the divide there. So you have a prime minister who has been, and a conservative leader who has been branded and defined by other people. And I think part of this has come from past associations he's had, as the Alliance Party leader with the National Citizens Coalition, having taken as an opposition MP and as a lobbyist, a very hardline position on a lot of issues. Even then, most of those were not social issues anyway. But you have a leader that everyone has believed for years and years, and even though he has a majority parliament, or had, I guess, that he was this, Bible-thumping Christian right tyrant who was going to, impose some form of Old Testament law on people. And it was laughable because I know that obviously that was an extreme way of describing it, but there were a lot of Christian conservatives who were hoping that would happen, who were hoping that he would come out swinging and say, we need to turn back the clock on gay marriage, we need to turn back the clock on abortion, and that never happened. So I find it funny that so many people were afraid of an agenda that, if it existed, would have come out at least in the last 4 years, if not the last 10.
Well, one of the things I always joke about is I think that, quite frankly, more Christian conservatives bought into the idea that Stephen Harper had a hidden agenda than liberals did. They sort of knew it was a joke. But that brings up sort of something else that should be examined, because one of the huge things that Justin campaigned on was tone. Right, I'm going to be a positive campaigner. Sunny days, my friends, as he said. Whereas as Stephen Harper was seen as, the mean guy who ran attack ads, and everyone's forgetting the attack ads the liberals used to launch on Stephen Harper. I'm sure no one can forget this one, right? The soldiers with guns in our cities ad, which I can see why, considering Justin Trudeau's father, he wouldn't run. There was the basically overt accusations of racism when the Reform Party and the Alliance first got together, from everyone up to Jean Chrétien himself. So in terms of attack ads, Stephen Harper has, I think, actually been pretty tame compared to his liberal counterparts in years just preceding his, right? Like, he's just not ready. Michael Ignatieff, he didn't come back for you. Stéphane Dion, it's hard to make priorities. Like, they're clever ads. I know when the Michael Ignatieff ones came out in 2011, I laughed my face off. But, they're really not that vicious.
Well, they're almost playful in a sense, too. And I'm one of these people that I have no issues whatsoever with attack ads or contrast ads, because I think that as much as people like to complain about them and say how mean they are, if they didn't work, they wouldn't keep running them.
Right.
And it's kind of interesting when you get people that say, this is wrong, this is terrible politics, and then in the next breath will be, I'm not going to vote for Michael Ignatieff. It has nothing to do with the ads, though. I'm just not going to vote for him because he doesn't love Canada. And people don't realize that this is what the advertising has done. So do I dislike that that's what politics is about in a lot of cases? Absolutely, but it's also a matter of human nature. And you know what? Whether you're dealing with a literature drop, whether you're dealing with an attack ad campaign, or whether you're dealing with conversations at the door when you're telling the person why you're better than the other person, politics is about contrast. And if we were seeing ads like you have seen in the past, in decades past, in the U.S., like, Tom Smith once drove through a small town in Vietnam that still loves communism. Is Tom Smith a communist? Like, stuff like that, it's so unacceptable in Canada, and for the most part always has been, at least going back to the 93 election with the Jean Chrétien ad that people said was mocking his disability.
Right.
And the thing about the ads that we're seeing is that you may not agree with the message, but they're contrast ads, which is in a a very different category than attack ads, and I'm not sure people understand that nuance there. One is about saying, this is why we're different than them, and yes, it can take an offensive tone, and the other is about actually maligning a person and doing nothing other than that.
So, do you think it was contrast that made Justin win? I predicted a Liberal minority on Election Day. That's what my assumption was, because so when the winds of change start blowing, there's not a lot you can do to stop it, especially when the majority of people aren't listing off specific policy initiatives of any party that they agree with, but they just want it's time for a change. But I will say I was surprised by the fact that he won a majority, and it doesn't bode well for social conservatives in a lot of different ways. Why do you think he won?
I don't necessarily think it was contrast that won, unless we really reduce the definition of contrast to one of he just wasn't Stephen Harper. And I think that this election was going to be an uphill battle for Stephen Harper anyway, and I don't really think that it was something that could have been changed with a different campaign. I've been actually trying in the last few days to parse, okay, what could Stephen Harper have done differently? And I can't think of any problem that doesn't result in needing a new leader. And by the way, that's not on my part anything to say that Stephen Harper is a bad leader, but he was the Conservative Party's weakest link electorally. And is it fair? No, but neither is politics. So I think that when we look at what Trudeau's biggest selling point was, it was that he was a different person. And you know what? When I think inadvertently the Conservatives were going just not ready and inexperienced, and what's this kid think he's doing playing at the grown-ups table? I think in a lot of ways those were endorsements of Justin Trudeau, because it reminded people, oh yeah, he's not a part of this old guard.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting, because so we've got a couple of reactions. You said as a radio host, it's going to be a good 4 years, and I know what you mean, because Jon Stewart was so depressed when George Bush left, kind of thing. For the pro-life movement specifically, there's the silver lining, quite frankly, is the fact that for years, as I mentioned earlier, people just assumed Stephen Harper was going to burst out of his hidden agenda closet and do something about everything. And that lent itself to a real spirit of complacency that's happened in the social conservative movement, whereas with a Trudeau, I don't think anyone's more emblematic of the fact that we have a lot of work to do. And I'm encouraged by the idea that people are going to realize that we have to do that work. We can't wait for politicians to do it. It's just a lot more obvious now, because the politicians wouldn't even if we wanted them to. But what were the things, the downsides that you saw from Justin Trudeau's re-election? And not just sort of the normal ones. We all know taxes will go up, blah, blah, blah. He's a bit of an idiot, and, I think that when it came to, look, in the Monk debates, when somebody asked him, how he's going to react to meetings like Russian strongman Vladimir Putin, people literally laughed out loud. And I think that the joke's on us now, but that was an indication of how much people respect him in that fashion. What's your take on what Trudeau's downsides will be?
Well, I'm not sure he's stupid in the sense that people have been saying that. I think that the problem is that people have underestimated him so much, or recognized that the bar was so low for him that it became very easy for him to clear it. Now, I think he's a bit of a drama queen, and I think that he's one of these people who loves the flourishes and loves the stylistic things more than he loves substance. Whereas you mentioned Stephen Harper as being somewhat boring, and I mean, despite Stephen Harper's polarity, he's been sort of the paragon of banality in terms of how he speaks. Like when I've interviewed him, and I've done it 3 times, I've met him more times. There's a very flat sense. It's, well, Andrew, there's this, and well, Andrew, there's this, and well, I think this, and I think this, and it's such a, not monotone in a sense of boringness or boredom-inducing, but it's a very flattened speech pattern, whereas Justin Trudeau loves the big gestures, the grand gestures. You can set, medieval fight music to his speeches, as people have done on YouTube, yeah, because there is such to him, like everything is, the speech of your life. And look, he's an orator. That's a good thing if you're looking at a politician who's going to be compelling. But the problem with that is that it becomes very easy to sell ideas to low-information voters who only really care about style and not substance. Whereas wonks like you and I can dissect the bullet points of a speech by anyone and say, well, wait, Stephen Harper just laid out a 10-point plan for, saving the world, and Justin Trudeau just gave a recipe for cornbread, but man, did he sound good when he did it.
Yeah.
And people get that energy level over substance, I think, in a campaign, especially when you look at the high voter turnout that we had this time around. You're getting in that a lot of low-information voters.
So to what extent is that the problem? Like, for example, Donald Trump, the promiscuous windbag in the States, is leading the primary contenders at the moment, when people have literally taken his speeches and put them to my drunk neighbor, and it's incredible how bang on it sounds like. And these are actual clips from his speeches. And the reason everyone says he's doing so well is that most politicians struggle just for name recognition alone. That's thus the lawn signs, right? People just want people to know their name. And of course, Justin Trudeau, based on his parents, had the ultimate Canadian name recognition coming into this. The name after Gretzky that's most well known in Canada is probably Trudeau. And what role do you think that played in it? Like, do you think people check it off because they just want change, because they've examined the policies? Or how much do you think name recognition ties into it? Because myself and most of my friends were volunteering for various campaigns, and they all emphasized the fact that name recognition was key.
That's a tough one, because a part of me doesn't understand, knowing what I know about history, how someone sharing a name with Pierre Trudeau could be a mark for them rather than a mark against them. Mm-hmm. So I have trouble understanding that, that could actually help someone. And then I have to remember that not everyone views things through that critical lens when they're looking historically at Pierre Elliott Trudeau's legacy. So look, I think it definitely played in. I don't know the extent of it, because we saw Stephen Harper and Thomas Mulcair go down that road early on of calling him Justin, Justin this and Justin that. And I don't think that was to remind people or to sort of get people to forget that he was a Trudeau. I think it was to make him look sort of childish.
Right.
And I think it may have worked at the time. But at the same time, Justin Trudeau, when needed, he whipped out that I'm Pierre Trudeau's son card, like he did in that one debate on the anniversary of Pierre Trudeau's death, like he did in several speeches. And he didn't do it to the point where it looked like he was trading off of his father's coattails, which was very skillfully executed.
Mm-hmm. I think that's the most surprising thing about his campaign, is it was quite brilliantly done. Like, those of us who think he is a lightweight, and I don't say that as somebody who hasn't been following. I've read his book, I've read his speeches, I've listened when I could. I do think he's a lightweight in terms of, well, I guess my contrast as well is that I've also read Pierre's book, Towards a Just Society, and I disagreed while I marveled at the depth of the intellect and the skill of the writing. But at the same time, Justin's sort of he ran a great campaign, and I think everyone expected him to fall on his face. That's why Corey Tenike, the conservative communications spokesman, actually said if he shows up with his pants on, he'll get points. Well, he did more than that, didn't he? And that seems to have really, really contradicted the conservative attack ads in a way that no other Liberal leader has done in recent years.
Oh, I completely agree. And yeah, that comment by Corey Tenike was very well placed, because he was basically saying, look, the bar is set so low, and I think that Corey was probably anticipating that would sort of stem the tide and start moving things in the other direction by making people aware of that. But it ended up being spun by the media as just some vindictive comment by Corey.
So what are the worst things that are going to happen under a Trudeau being Prime Minister?
Well, I think that for a lot of people, I mean, if you look at it from a social conservative lens, the worst thing that can happen is nothing, because, social conservatives, politically speaking, are pretty much on the losing end of most of the issues of the day. There are things like assisted suicide, which I think will require a national conversation, and I'm not sure having a majority government, while we do that, is going to be good, because ultimately they can rubber stamp whatever the leader says, and I think we know how he's going to fall on that issue. If we look at it from sort of the country's health more broadly, I think we are dealing with a couple of the points that you mentioned earlier. You're going to see, obviously, someone who wants to increase taxes, someone who wants to increase spending, and is quite proud about it. I mean, he was running a campaign further to the left than the NDP Thomas Mulcair party. So I think not having really an official opposition that has any ability to block legislation in and of itself is the danger here.
And that's interesting because, like, I wrote an article the day after the election, and then the reason the election does depress me is, one, assisted suicide. Like, my family's from the Netherlands, so we have a pretty good view of exactly what happens when assisted suicide and euthanasia becomes legal. And especially in Canada right now, we have an aging population, huge numbers of elderly people that are needing access to the healthcare system now, and especially over the next 2 decades. So the conundrums we're going to be facing are very real and very scary. People, when they take their loved ones to the hospital, are going to find out what rationing looks like, and a medical system that is okay with assisting people in dying, essentially medical professionals killing people, is going to be on the rise. And I think that's something that people are going to notice more than abortion, because abortion's a beginning of life thing, right? People can have an abortion and not tell anyone. The end of life debate is different, because the person who's going has, generally speaking at least, had quite a long life, is known to a lot of people, is loved by a lot of people. The discussion is much more complicated. So I think that's going to raise the profile of the value of life arguments big time, and not necessarily in a good way at all, because we always end up talking about really depressing anecdotes that come out around these things. With ISIS, which is the question that you asked Justin Trudeau when you spoke with him, right? He's already told Obama he's pulling out. And that's something that really bothers me, because if somebody who's if you won't bomb ISIS, who will you bomb? I guess is the thing that I think, right? Like, these people are, bent on an orgy of rape and crucifixion and torture, and they invent new ways of murdering people. It's like watching a weird horror movie with Middle Eastern characters, like 24, where all the Jack Bauers are Middle Eastern. So I guess there's a lot of bad news in that fashion, but what's the good news if there is any? And I've been very hesitant to give anyone any encouragement, just because I think that false encouragement just encourages complacency. And if there's anything we've seen from this election campaign, it's that conservatives were complacent. They didn't put forward any new change. They didn't even bother to wrap their own record as a record of change, which they very easily could have done with a few clever spin doctors. And I think that we have a lot of really hard work ahead of us, from a leadership race to in the social conservative movement, ensuring that people actually vote on the beliefs that they share with us. But is there any upside to any of this?
Well, I have to go back and take issue with one of the things you mentioned about the conservative legacy, because one thing that I feel people need to realize here is that government, by its very definition, by its very mandate, is something that only serves to screw people over. The bigger government gets, the more it hurts people economically, the more it hurts people in terms of their personal freedom. So even though you can look at Stephen Harper's legacy and say, in his 9, almost 10 years in office, he didn't do this. And there were some big things on his checklist that didn't get done that I wish. Like, for example, real Senate reform.
Right.
Like, for example, a real bottom-to-top reform of the tax code, of income taxing. However, having someone in there that is not doing what someone on the left would have done for 9 years is, in fact, a benefit to the voters, and is, in fact, a benefit to the Canadians. So even though he didn't perhaps lobby for or push for substantive change like people on the right would have liked, him being there was 10 years that someone else couldn't have put in. This generation's version of the long gun registry, this generation's version of whatever the issue of the day that a leftist government would have done in the same time. So I still think there is something to be proud of if we look at it through the perspective of what government could have done if they were focused on expanding the size of government in that same time.
Right. And that's precisely what the Maclean's editor, Paul Wells, said in his book, The Longer I'm Prime Minister, is that the incremental change was in what he didn't do as much as what he did do. But you have parents around my age, and you see a lot of these concerns coming. Do you think that there's any way to put a positive spin on Justin Trudeau's endorsement of euthanasia and things like that? And because I think the social issues we're about to face, right? I work educating people on abortion all the time, and I'm quite well aware that for many people it's an abstract issue, because even for pro-choice people, it's not one they consider until the situation faces them. But I really do believe that the issues that we're going to be facing in the coming days, like euthanasia, assisted suicide, are issues that are going to affect all of us, because we all have parents older than ourselves, and many of us are blessed to have grandparents still, or older family friends, and these are discussions we're all going to be having.
Yeah, and I think you're very correct there, but at the same time, I also have to wonder if part of the problem with euthanasia is that we haven't seen enough of a focus on really telling people what it is, because
right.
I've had this happen on my radio show where I'll talk about euthanasia, and someone will call in and they'll give a position that is actually a position on assisted suicide.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the fact that people use those two interchangeably shows that when there is time for government to actually act on this, it's going to be very difficult for people to fight it, because a lot of people will be fighting something that the general population doesn't even know is a thing.
Right.
It's no different in my eyes than when you're looking at what you do in abortion education, and you're talking to people who have no idea that there is unrestricted abortion
right.
in Canada up until a minute before the child is born.
Right.
And unless you can properly educate people on the status quo and on what the things are, you can't educate them on the actual position. So that's going to be, I think, a huge issue when euthanasia does come up, is that you're going to have people that don't actually know what it is and think they're weighing in on another one, recognizing that on paper, assisted suicide is a lot more sympathetic than euthanasia is.
Well, and here's where the social conservative movement has failed time and time again. There was polling done about 10 years ago that showed that the vast majority, close to 70% of Canadians, were on board with euthanasia until they had a 15-minute conversation. After that 15-minute conversation, it was reduced to about 40%, right? Dropped by 30 points, which means that, we knew what to do about the issue, which is that you need to start having 15-minute conversations across the country. But like with so many other strategies that would actually change the way people think, the social conservative movement looked at, well, what can we do with our resources rather than what has to be done. But it's a bit of a joke to say we're going to oppose euthanasia and not do the only thing we know will work. And this is one of the consistent problems across the board, is that, winning strategies are very difficult. Winning strategies are often very expensive. And winning strategies demand that we talk to thousands of people, which is what I do, is we talk to people about abortion. It's often very uncomfortable, very awkward, but we have face-to-face conversations with them. That's the only thing that works. Where do you think the conservative movement really screwed up in the lead-up to the second coming of Trudeau?
I think, for starters, underestimating him, not running a campaign like they should have been doing. And I think the other part, though, and I want to make sure I make this point, it's not entirely fair to blame solely the Conservatives. I think that Thomas Mulcair's poor campaign also contributed as well. And in a lot of ways, a Conservative victory would have required some level of vote splitting, which really didn't happen here.
Right. Well, people have been calling you nonstop. People have been calling me nonstop as well, and they've been asking for what my thoughts on the election are. So what are you saying to the people who are calling you?
Well, for starters, stop calling me.
Right.
Secondly, no, in all seriousness, though, I think that every time there is a massive change, people get into this fight-or-flight sense, and you always hear it every time there's an election, no matter where it is. Well, that's it. I'm leaving blank. I'm leaving Ontario, I'm leaving Canada, I'm leaving the U.S., and they never actually end up going anywhere. But I think that when people are, telling me the sky is falling, the sky is not falling. We had a centrist/right-leaning government for 9 years in Canada, and I think there are going to be some major changes we see under Justin Trudeau, but nothing is irreparable. And I think this is the big thing, because what I said earlier needs to be said again. If you focus on changing minds culturally, if you focus on changing minds in the way people view the world, not just the way or which particular politicians are in, it won't matter what the politicians are doing. And the work that's being done outside of the House of Commons, outside of the Senate, outside of the Prime Minister's office, is more important than what happens in it. Because, look, we see every 4 years or sometimes less a changing of the guard.
Right.
And how much really changes in your day-to-day life from year to year? Not all that much.
Right. Well, Andrew, thanks so much for taking the time to talk with us.
Great to be on, Jonathan. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was Andrew Lawton, host of the Andrew Lawton Show on AM 980, talking about the Canadian election, what we can expect going ahead, and what went so wrong. We hope you'll join us again next week on Thursday again. Thanks so much for joining us, and have a great weekend.